Eleanor Harrow was 38 years old when the river company declared her a burden, dismissed her without wages, and left her standing on the muddy bank of the Greystone River with only $3.72 sewn into the hem of her skirt. The same men who had praised her careful hands during years of bookkeeping now claimed a woman had no place asking questions about missing cargo after the spring floods, and the town quietly accepted their judgment because powerful men rarely needed to explain themselves. Hungry, exhausted, and carrying little more than a weathered satchel, she spent $2 at a neglected county auction outside Brimstead to purchase the rotting Sunken Ferry everyone else considered nothing more than swollen timber waiting to become firewood. The spectators laughed until their voices drifted across the water with the gulls. Certain desperation had finally stolen her good sense. None of them imagined that beneath layers of silt and black river mud, behind warped planks no one had bothered to inspect for nearly 20 years, something remained sealed away with remarkable patience, waiting not simply to alter one forgotten woman's future, but to restore trust to an entire valley that had slowly forgotten what honesty looked like. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Harrow.
If you're watching from a place that others have forgotten, tell us in the comments. Forgotten places often remember the most important stories. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy slow, heartfelt stories about forgotten places, quiet courage, and hidden history.
Long before hardship wrapped itself around Eleanor Harrow like winter fog along the Greystone River, she had grown up in a small clapboard house overlooking the same restless water that would one day test every lesson her parents had ever placed inside her heart. The town of Brimstead rested where the river bent around low hills covered in pine and maple, and nearly every family depended on the ferries that carried people, livestock, letters, flour, lumber, and hope from one shore to the other. Riverboats came and went with the seasons, but the ferries belonged to the town itself, familiar enough that children recognized each captain by the sound of his whistle before the vessel appeared through the morning mist. Her father, Samuel Harrow, repaired wooden boats with such quiet patience that people often stood nearby simply to watch him work. He believed that wood carried memory, that every board remembered the tree it once had been. Every knot held the story of storms survived, and every crack warned careful listeners before disaster arrived. He never hurried a repair because he insisted haste only disguised mistakes instead of fixing them. When Eleanor was still small enough to stand beneath his workbench without bumping her head, Samuel began teaching her how to study things others ignored. He would hand her broken hinges, cracked oars, rusted nails, or splintered handles, and ask what they wished to become again. At first she laughed, because she thought the question foolish. "They don't speak," she answered. "They do," her father replied with a smile. Just not with words. Slowly, she learned to notice grain patterns in timber, the smell of fresh pine compared with old cedar, the difference between honest wear and careless damage. Her father insisted every object revealed its history to anyone willing to look long enough. Her mother, Margaret, taught entirely different lessons, though they reached the same destination. She kept the town's small reading room beside the church, where shelves leaned beneath the weight of journals, shipping records, atlases, hymnals, and novels, carried by travelers over many decades. Margaret believed that written records preserved truth, long after memories became convenient. "People forget," she often said while carefully repairing torn pages. "Ink remembers." Eleanor spent countless afternoons copying old manifests simply to improve her handwriting. She learned columns of figures before most children mastered multiplication, and she discovered satisfaction in balancing accounts so perfectly that every penny found its proper place. Her parents never imagined raising someone important. They hoped only to raise someone dependable. Dependable people rarely became famous. They quietly became necessary. Brimstead itself moved with steady rhythm. Spring brought swollen rivers carrying melting snow from distant mountains. Summer filled the docks with merchants whose wagons crowded every road into town. Autumn painted the forests gold, while warehouses stored grain against winter. When snow arrived, life slowed enough for neighbors to gather around fireplaces, exchanging stories that seemed to grow slightly larger every year. Eleanor loved those evenings because older residents spoke of the river almost as though it possessed a soul. They described impossible rescues, mysterious lights dancing across fog, strange cargo recovered after storms, and acts of kindness that had quietly saved entire families from ruin without ever appearing in newspapers. Most stories ended with someone choosing honesty over profit. Those endings stayed with her. As she entered adulthood, the Greystone River Navigation Company expanded rapidly under ambitious new investors who cared more about efficiency than tradition. Larger warehouses appeared beside the docks. More ferries crossed each day. Ledgers multiplied until careful bookkeeping became almost as valuable as skilled captains. Because Eleanor possessed remarkable accuracy and refused to guess when certainty remained possible, she found work keeping shipping records for the company. She neither sought promotion nor avoided responsibility. Instead, responsibility found her. Captains trusted her manifests because mistakes nearly disappeared whenever Eleanor prepared them. Merchants appreciated receiving exact inventories. Travelers often noticed the quiet woman seated behind polished oak desks recording arrivals while chaos swirled around her. She listened more than she spoke. She observed more than she questioned. People mistook silence for weakness. It rarely was. Among the company's older employees worked Amos Bell, whose beard had turned completely white before Eleanor began her first day. Amos inspected ropes, chains, anchors, and ferry cables, claiming every piece of iron deserved daily respect, because rivers punished neglect without mercy. He frequently stopped beside Eleanor's desk after finishing inspections. "What did your numbers tell you today?" he would ask. She usually answered by mentioning delayed shipments or unusually heavy cargo. Amos always nodded thoughtfully. "The river tells its stories through weight," he would reply. "Never ignore numbers. They're quieter than voices, but they're harder to fool." Years passed peacefully enough that Eleanor almost believed life would continue unchanged forever. She rented a modest cottage overlooking wildflowers each spring. She planted beans, onions, herbs, and roses beside the porch. She baked bread every Saturday. She volunteered to organize church donation records because no one else enjoyed sorting receipts. Children waved whenever she crossed town, carrying ledgers beneath one arm. Older widows trusted her to read difficult letters. Travelers remembered her kindness more than her face. Her life lacked excitement. It overflowed with purpose. Then, the weather changed. The spring storms of 1894 arrived earlier than anyone expected. Rain hammered rooftops for nearly 3 weeks without meaningful pause. The Greystone River rose inch by inch until familiar landmarks disappeared beneath brown water, carrying uprooted trees, shattered fences, and entire sections of distant barns downstream. Captains delayed crossings whenever possible. Warehouses stacked cargo higher than ever before. Everyone waited for calmer days. Instead, the river grew angrier. One terrible evening lightning split the sky, while winds howled through Brimstead with frightening force. Bells rang from the church tower, warning residents to stay indoors. Lanterns flickered behind rain-covered windows. Along the docks, workers struggled desperately to secure boats before floodwaters carried them away. Among those vessels stood the old ferry named Mercy Bell. She had served Brimstead faithfully for decades, transporting thousands of passengers across calm and storm alike. Though newer ferries had gradually replaced her busiest routes, townspeople still smiled whenever they saw her broad wooden deck crossing morning fog. That night, the Mercy Bell attempted one final emergency crossing, after word arrived that several families remained stranded on the opposite bank. She never returned. The storm swallowed sound itself. By sunrise, only scattered wreckage floated along the flooded shoreline. Search crews worked for days. Several passengers survived after clinging to debris. Others were never found. Neither was the ferry. Eventually, officials concluded she had sunk somewhere within the deepest bend of the Greystone River, where shifting currents buried wreckage beneath layers of mud. The town mourned. Memorial services filled the church. Life slowly continued, because survival often demands movement before healing arrives. Years passed. Children who had witnessed the disaster became adults. The story settled into local memory like an old scar. People still pointed toward the river bend and lowered their voices, but fewer remembered individual names with each passing season. Only Eleanor continued reading every surviving report whenever spring floods returned. She noticed little inconsistencies. Passenger totals varied. Cargo descriptions changed from one ledger to another. Certain entries appeared strangely incomplete. She assumed grief had simply produced confusion. Until much later. For nearly a decade afterward, the company prospered again. New investors arrived. Fresh paint covered old buildings. People preferred speaking about the future instead of painful history. Then Amos Bell retired. Within a year, Samuel Harrow passed away quietly after a brief illness, leaving Eleanor with his worn tools and his habit of studying broken things before discarding them. She grieved without complaint. Her mother followed 2 winters later. The little house overlooking the river became unbearably silent. Still, Eleanor continued working, because steady routines often become bridges across sorrow. She believed faithful work would protect what remained of her ordinary life. She could not yet see that the very honesty making her valuable was slowly guiding her toward questions powerful men wished would remain buried far deeper than any forgotten ferry beneath the river mud. For weeks after her parents were gone, Eleanor poured herself into columns of figures and shipping manifests, because numbers behaved more faithfully than grief. Every invoice balanced or failed to balance according to simple rules, and she found comfort in that certainty. The Greystone River Navigation Company continued expanding under its confident new director, Horace Pembroke, a polished businessman whose tailored coats never seemed to collect dust despite the muddy streets surrounding the docks. He spoke often about progress, efficiency, and leaving old tragedies behind, and most townspeople admired him because prosperity appeared to follow wherever he invested. Eleanor admired only accuracy, and accuracy eventually led her towards something no one else seemed willing to notice. It began with a shipment of imported machinery that weighed nearly 300 pounds less when unloaded than when it had been loaded upstream. The difference might have been explained by damaged crates or careless measurements, yet the accompanying paperwork had been rewritten twice, each version carrying different figures in different handwriting. Eleanor quietly corrected the ledger, filed both copies together, and assumed she would ask a supervisor the following morning. Before she could, another discrepancy appeared, then another. Missing cargo, altered inventories, receipts signed by men who insisted they had never seen the documents before. None of the losses were enormous by themselves. Each looked like an ordinary mistake. Together, they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Eleanor spent evenings comparing years of manifests against warehouse inventories, copying figures by lamplight until her fingers cramped. The deeper she searched, the stranger everything became. Certain shipments disappeared completely from official records after arriving safely in Brimstead. Valuable trunks belonging to travelers were marked unclaimed, even when families later insisted they had collected them. Boxes of jewelry, legal deeds, military pensions, heirlooms, and locked chests simply faded from the books as though they had never existed. One rainy afternoon, she carried her findings to Horace Pembroke's office. He listened with folded hands and an expression that never changed. When she finished, he thanked her politely, accepted the papers, and promised to investigate. For 3 days, nothing happened. On the 4th morning, she arrived to discover another clerk seated behind her desk. Horace summoned her upstairs, where 2 company attorneys waited beside the window. They informed her that repeated questioning of company records had disrupted operations, damaged employee confidence, and demonstrated conduct unsuitable for a woman entrusted with confidential information. Eleanor attempted to explain that she had only followed the numbers wherever they led. Horace smiled without warmth. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the greatest wisdom is knowing which questions belong to those above your station." She refused to apologize for honesty. By sunset, she no longer had employment. Her final wages were withheld, pending an internal review that never took place. Her rented cottage belonged to the company. Within 5 days, she packed every possession she owned into 2 worn cases before surrendering the key. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, uncertain whether pity or caution should guide them. Rumors spread quickly through Brimstead. Some claimed Eleanor had stolen records. Others whispered she had become unstable after losing her parents. The company never accused her publicly. It merely allowed uncertainty to do its work. Respect vanished with astonishing speed. Shopkeepers who once greeted her warmly now nodded without meeting her eyes. Invitations stopped arriving. Even church conversations became painfully brief. Nobody wished to anger the town's largest employer. Eleanor sold nearly everything she owned. The walnut rocking chair built by her father disappeared first. Then her mother's china, her winter coats, her spare blankets, books she had loved since childhood. Every sale felt less like earning money than watching memories carried away by strangers. When all was finished, she counted $3.72. That small sum represented her entire future. She considered leaving Brimstead forever. Several neighboring towns needed clerks, and no road physically prevented her from starting again. Yet every time she packed her satchel, her father's voice returned. "Wood remembers." Her mother's answered. "Ink remembers." And Amos Bell added one more thought. "Numbers are harder to fool. If all 3 lessons remain true, then something inside Brimstead still remembered the truth, even if its people had chosen to forget. So she stayed. She rented nothing because she could afford nothing. Instead, she slept several nights inside the loft of an abandoned grain shed after receiving quiet permission from its elderly owner, Mrs. Lydia Boone, who asked no questions beyond whether Eleanor had eaten. Pride would have rejected the kindness. Hunger accepted it gratefully. During those lonely evenings, Eleanor often walked beside the Greystone River, listening to water slide past broken pilings left from older docks. She found herself stopping near the broad bend where the Mercy Bell had vanished all those years before. Spring currents had shifted again, exposing sections of dark timber barely visible beneath the surface. Children skipped stones nearby without noticing. Fishermen paid no attention. The remains looked like nothing more than driftwood trapped along the bank. One morning, a faded notice appeared outside the county courthouse, announcing a public auction of abandoned river property recovered or claimed after recent floods. Most items consisted of damaged wagons, cracked barrels, rusted anchors, broken furniture, and miscellaneous lumber. Near the bottom of the list appeared a brief description that almost everyone ignored. Sunken Ferry wreck rights, believed to be Mercy Bell, sold as salvage only. Eleanor read the notice 3 times. Salvage rights meant ownership of whatever legally remained inside the vessel, unless previous claims had been settled. The words settled heavily inside her thoughts. She hurried to the courthouse archives and requested every surviving record concerning the Mercy Bell disaster. Dust drifted through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight as she carefully unfolded aging documents. Passenger lists remained incomplete. Recovery reports contradicted one another. Insurance papers mentioned numerous personal valuables presumed permanently lost beneath the river. Watches, wedding rings, family Bibles, property deeds, locked strongboxes, military medals, letters, savings hidden inside traveling trunks. The insurance company had eventually closed the case because the wreck itself had never been recovered. Eleanor stared at one final report signed nearly 20 years earlier. Due to hazardous river conditions, full examination impossible. Vessel presumed buried beneath silt. Search terminated. Something about those words troubled her. Presumed buried. Not confirmed. Presumed. The following Saturday, nearly the entire auction attracted farmers seeking inexpensive lumber. Whenever the auctioneer announced damaged wagons, bidding became lively. Rusted tools sold quickly. Crates fetched modest prices. Then he reached the final entry. Rights to the old ferry wreck, believed to be the Mercy Bell, sold strictly as salvage, no guarantee of usable timber. Laughter drifted through the crowd. "You'll spend more pulling her out than she's worth," someone called. "Fish own her now," another joked. The auctioneer waited. Silence answered him. Eleanor felt every eye turn toward the forgotten listing. She reached carefully into her pocket and wrapped trembling fingers around $2 bills. $2, she said. More laughter followed. The auctioneer looked around for another offer. None came. Sold. His hammer struck once. Just like that, ownership of the river's oldest secret passed to the poorest woman in Brimstead. Several men shook their heads as Eleanor accepted the folded certificate. One remarked loudly that desperation often disguised itself as optimism. Another predicted she would use the papers to start a cooking fire because they held greater value than the wreck itself. Eleanor said nothing. She simply thanked the auctioneer and walked toward the river carrying documents lighter than a loaf of bread yet somehow heavier than iron. $2 remained in her pocket? No. After paying the fee required to register the sale, she counted $1.63. It was almost nothing. Yet for the first time since losing her position, she owned something nobody could take away with a polite letter and a company seal. The next morning dawned gray and cool beneath low clouds. Borrowing an old rowboat from Mrs. Boone's nephew, Eleanor pushed slowly toward the river bend, where broken beams protruded from the water like old bones. The current resisted every stroke. Muddy water concealed nearly everything beneath the surface, but the exposed timbers matched sketches preserved in the courthouse records. This truly was the Mercy Bell. She tied the boat to a leaning post and carefully stepped onto the slick remains. Every board groaned beneath her weight. Moss-covered handrails once polished smooth by thousands of passengers. Bent iron fittings peeked through thick layers of silt. Nature had spent years patiently reclaiming every inch. Eleanor explored cautiously, remembering her father's warnings about rotten wood. Most of the upper deck had collapsed into the hull below, leaving only narrow pathways between broken beams. She searched not for treasure, but for evidence, hoping merely to understand how the ferry had settled. Then she noticed something unusual. Near the center of the wreck, where floodwaters had washed away part of the mud, several heavy iron bolts remained surprisingly free of rust. She knelt beside them. The bolts secured what appeared to be a reinforced hatch, almost completely hidden beneath collapsed planking. Ferries of that period usually stored supplies beneath ordinary wooden covers. Reinforced iron served little purpose unless protecting something unusually valuable. She brushed away layers of wet silt with both hands until the outline became clearer. The hatch had not burst open during the sinking. It remained tightly sealed. Stranger still, its locking mechanism appeared intact. Eleanor leaned closer. Wedged between the hatch frame and a cracked beam, she discovered a small brass object, glinting faintly beneath decades of river mud. She carefully worked it free, rinsed it in the cold water beside the boat, and stared in astonishment. It was a beautifully engraved baggage claim token bearing the number 47 on one side and the initials GRNC on the other. The metal shone beneath the grime as though it had waited all those years for someone willing to look closely, instead of merely glancing past. Eleanor slipped the token into her pocket, rested one hand upon the sealed hatch, and felt an unexpected certainty settle over her. Whatever lay beneath that iron cover had never reached the bottom of the river by accident, and someone long ago had gone to remarkable lengths to make certain it stayed hidden. Eleanor remained kneeling beside the reinforced hatch until the afternoon light began slipping behind the western ridge, the brass token resting heavily inside her pocket despite its modest weight. The river whispered against the broken hull, with the patient voice of something that had watched generations arrive, believing themselves permanent, before carrying each of them quietly into memory. She traced her fingers over the iron bands crossing the hatch once more, and noticed shallow scratches surrounding the lock, marks too deliberate to have been made by drifting debris. Someone had attempted to force it open long ago. Someone had failed. She reluctantly returned the borrowed rowboat to Mrs. Boone's nephew before darkness settled across Brimstead, carrying with her only the baggage token and a mind filled with questions that refused to loosen their grip. Sleep proved impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the hidden compartment beneath the ferry, untouched beneath layers of river mud, while nearly 20 years of seasons passed overhead. Before dawn, she spread courthouse copies, old ferry diagrams, insurance reports, and passenger lists across the rough wooden table inside the grain loft. She compared measurements until her candle burned low. One faded construction drawing caught her attention. The Mercy Belle had originally included a secure compartment beneath the main deck, specifically built for passengers wishing to store valuables during difficult crossings. Jewelry, legal documents, family heirlooms, payroll chests, military pensions, land deeds, and other precious belongings could be locked away for the duration of the journey. The compartment had been advertised as fireproof and nearly impossible to force open. Eleanor frowned. If such a vault existed, why had so few reports mentioned it after the disaster? She searched every newspaper account she possessed. Reporters described the storm, the rescue attempts, grieving families, and the presumed loss of luggage. Yet almost none referred directly to the secure compartment. It was as though history itself had quietly stepped around its existence. By sunrise, she walked toward the church reading room where her mother had once worked. The building now belonged to elderly Reverend Thomas Alder, who maintained its shelves with gentle care despite failing eyesight. He smiled warmly upon seeing Eleanor, offering no questions about her dismissal from the river company. Instead, he simply unlocked the archive cabinet and invited her to search whatever records she needed. Dust floated lazily through narrow windows while Eleanor carefully unfolded decades-old local newspapers bound together with twine. Hours passed before she discovered a brief article printed only 4 days after the sinking. It reported that surviving passengers insisted they had surrendered valuables to the ferry's secure storage before departure. Strangely, every later article omitted that detail entirely. Someone had even clipped the remainder of the page from one preserved edition. Reverend Alder noticed the missing section and sighed softly. "I remember that week," he said. "People argued endlessly about what had been lost. Then quite suddenly, nobody spoke of it anymore." "Why?" Eleanor asked. The old minister looked toward the window overlooking the river. "Because grief exhausts people, and because powerful men often persuade tired people to stop asking uncomfortable questions." Eleanor thanked him before continuing her search. Near the bottom of another stack, she discovered a leather-bound register listing property claims submitted after the Mercy Belle disaster. More than 60 families had described valuables entrusted to the ferry's secure compartment. Wedding rings passed through generations, pocket watches engraved with family names, gold coins saved for new farms, insurance bonds, letters from soldiers who had never returned home, birth certificates, marriage licenses, Bibles containing handwritten family histories, tiny velvet pouches filled with gemstones. One elderly widow had listed nothing more valuable than a small carved wooden music box, explaining that it contained the final lullaby her late husband had composed before dying of illness. Reading those descriptions filled Eleanor with quiet sorrow. None of the claims had ever been resolved because the ferry itself remained missing. Yet she could not ignore the remarkable possibility growing stronger inside her thoughts. If the reinforced compartment beneath the wreck remained sealed, perhaps those belongings had never scattered into the river at all. Perhaps they had remained exactly where grieving families had last entrusted them. The realization made her hands tremble. She returned immediately to the ferry, carrying a borrowed shovel, rope, pry bar, lantern, and several brushes once belonging to her father. Progress came painfully slowly. Thick mud surrounded the hatch like hardened clay, forcing Eleanor to scrape away layers inch by inch without damaging the old wood beneath. Her clothes became soaked, her hands blistered. Several times she nearly abandoned the effort when the river current shifted unexpectedly, rocking the unstable wreck beneath her feet. By late afternoon, enough of the hatch stood exposed to reveal a heavy brass lock still attached to its iron mechanism. It appeared remarkably intact despite decades underwater. Eleanor examined it carefully before freezing. Stamped beside the keyhole appeared the same number engraved upon the baggage token in her pocket, 47. She withdrew the token and gently pressed it against the lock. It was not merely a claim marker. One narrow edge contained tiny grooves almost invisible beneath tarnish. Her pulse quickened. It had been fashioned to serve as a specialized key. Whoever designed the secure compartment had disguised each key as an ordinary baggage token, carried by the passenger receiving the storage receipt. Eleanor carefully inserted the grooved edge into the lock. It resisted at first. She refused to force it. Instead, she cleaned more silt from the opening, using the corner of her handkerchief. Then she tried again. A deep metallic click echoed beneath the hull. She scarcely breathed. Slowly, using both hands, she lifted the reinforced hatch. Damp air escaped from below, carrying a faint scent of cedar rather than decay. A narrow stair descended into darkness. The compartment remained astonishingly dry compared with the surrounding wreck, because its walls had been lined with thick tar and reinforced oak. Eleanor lowered the lantern cautiously. Shelves emerged from the shadows. Wooden chests, leather cases, tin document boxes, wrapped parcels, canvas satchels. Everything rested exactly where it had been secured before the storm. Time itself seemed to have stopped within those silent walls. She descended carefully, afraid that even breathing too deeply might disturb something sacred. Dust coated every surface. Spider webs stretched between brass hooks. Yet the compartment remained intact. She opened nothing immediately. Instead, she walked slowly along the shelves, reading faded labels attached with twine. Passenger names appeared one after another. Abigail Morton, Henry Pike, Reverend Caleb Sloan, Martha Ellery, Joseph Whitcomb, Clara Dawson. Some names she recognized from weathered gravestones outside town. Others belonged to families still living in Brimstead, who had believed these possessions vanished forever. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision. She understood then that she was not standing inside a treasure vault. She was standing inside a room, preserving interrupted lives. Every package represented hopes, carried onto the ferry that stormy evening. She selected the smallest leather case and carefully brushed away dust. A paper label identified its owner as Edith Fairchild. Attached beside the name hung another baggage token matching the number stamped into the lock. Eleanor hesitated before opening the clasps. Inside rested a wedding veil folded with remarkable care, accompanied by 2 gold rings wrapped inside embroidered cloth, and a handwritten note addressed to Edith from her father. The ink remained perfectly legible. "Wear these with joy, my daughter, and remember your mother smiled when she chose them." Eleanor closed the case immediately. She had no right to linger over private words. She replaced everything exactly as she had found it. Moving farther inside, she discovered larger trunks containing legal ledgers, silverware, framed photographs, children's toys, military medals, and bundles of correspondence tied neatly with ribbon. One iron strongbox remained sealed with wax bearing the crest of the state land office. Nearby stood several payroll chests stamped with mining company marks. Each shelf represented another family waiting almost 2 decades for answers they believed impossible. Then Eleanor noticed something entirely unexpected. Against the far wall stood a narrow oak cabinet, built differently from the passenger shelves. Unlike the others, it bore no owner's name. Instead, a brass plate simply read, "Purser." She opened it cautiously. Inside rested official ferry ledgers, route books, maintenance records, and a locked document case, scarcely larger than a family Bible. Tucked beneath the case lay a folded letter addressed not to any passenger but to whoever might eventually discover the compartment. Eleanor unfolded the brittle paper with extraordinary care. The handwriting belonged to Captain Elias Mercer, master of the Mercy Bell. "If this reaches honest hands," it began, "then Providence has accomplished what I could not. The company ordered me to transfer certain passenger valuables before departure into a warehouse, under revised accounting. I refused because no lawful receipts existed. I feared theft disguised as paperwork. Therefore, I concealed the official inventory within this compartment, intending to deliver it personally after crossing. Should we fail to reach shore, let this record prove that every article listed remained aboard under my protection when the storm overtook us." Eleanor's breath caught. Beneath the letter rested a meticulously detailed inventory, bearing signatures from passengers confirming each deposited item. It matched the surviving insurance claims almost perfectly. Captain Mercer had documented everything. Even more astonishing, another page listed several company officials who had attempted to pressure him into surrendering selected valuables before departure, without proper documentation. One name stood at the top: Nathaniel Pembroke. Eleanor stared at the surname. Nathaniel Pembroke had founded the Greystone River Navigation Company decades earlier. Horace Pembroke, the very man who had dismissed her, was his son. Suddenly, countless inconsistencies aligned with frightening clarity. If Nathaniel had survived the storm while Captain Mercer had not, he could have quietly claimed the compartment had been swept away with the wreck. Without the inventory, grieving families possessed little proof beyond memory. Insurance settlements eventually closed the matter. Questions faded. Generations passed. But Captain Mercer had anticipated betrayal. He had hidden the inventory where only the compartment itself could reveal it. Eleanor's thoughts raced. Had Nathaniel intended to recover the wreck secretly? Had someone searched unsuccessfully before the shifting river buried it beyond reach? Had the missing page from the newspaper been removed deliberately to erase mention of the secure compartment? Every possibility pointed toward the same unsettling conclusion. The greatest secret inside the Mercy Bell was not simply the fortune preserved within its walls. It was evidence that an honorable captain had sacrificed his final opportunity to protect wealth not belonging to him, while another man may have spent the next 20 years allowing innocent families to believe everything had been swallowed forever. Eleanor carefully returned every paper exactly as she had found it. She knew she could not simply carry everything into town. Too many people would attempt to seize the discovery before the rightful owners learned the truth. As she climbed back through the hatch, evening sunlight spilled across the quiet river in ribbons of gold. The Mercy Bell no longer seemed like a broken wreck abandoned by history. She had become a faithful guardian, keeping watch over dozens of forgotten promises, until someone patient enough, honest enough, and overlooked enough finally arrived to hear what the river had remembered all along. Eleanor lowered the reinforced hatch once more, covering it carefully with loose planks and river mud, until the hidden compartment looked almost exactly as it had before her discovery. She knew that truth, once revealed carelessly, could disappear as easily as a footprint beside moving water. Carrying only Captain Mercer's letter, a certified copy of the inventory, and the brass baggage token, she returned quietly to Brimstead after sunset. By the following morning, word had somehow begun spreading that Eleanor Harrow had been seen working around the old ferry wreck. Curiosity moved through the town faster than wagons. Before noon, Horace Pembroke appeared at the grain shed, accompanied by the county sheriff and 2 company foremen. Horace greeted Eleanor with the same polished smile he had worn while dismissing her weeks earlier. He explained that the Greystone River Navigation Company had recently reviewed forgotten property records, and now believed the ferry legally belonged to the company after all. Eleanor calmly unfolded the auction certificate bearing the county seal. The sheriff examined it carefully before nodding once. "She purchased the salvage rights lawfully," he said. Horace's smile tightened. "Surely we can arrange a reasonable settlement." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "The settlement belongs to the people who entrusted their belongings to that ferry." For the first time, genuine irritation crossed Horace's face. He warned that disturbing an old wreck created safety concerns, hinted that lawsuits could follow, and reminded Eleanor that respected companies possessed greater resources than unemployed clerks. She listened without interruption. When he finally finished, she asked only one question. "Did your father ever speak about Captain Elias Mercer?" Horace's expression changed so quickly that even the sheriff noticed. "My father's affairs are not your concern," he answered, before turning sharply toward his carriage. The confrontation accomplished exactly what Eleanor feared. Someone knew the discovery mattered. That evening, she visited Reverend Alder, Mrs. Boone, Amos Bell, and 3 other elderly residents whose honesty had never been questioned. Without showing them the hidden compartment itself, She allowed each of them to read Captain Mercer's letter and compare it against the inventory. Silence filled the reading room after the final page had been passed around. Amos Bell removed his spectacles slowly. "I inspected the Mercy Belle the week before she sailed," he whispered. Captain Mercer refused to cut corners, even when others mocked him for delaying departures. Reverend Alder folded the letter carefully. "This belongs before the entire town." "Not yet," Eleanor replied gently. "First, the compartment must be opened in the presence of witnesses, or people will claim the contents were planted." The old minister nodded. Wisely spoken. Notices were posted throughout Brimstead, announcing that, 3 mornings later, the recovered ferry compartment would be opened publicly under county supervision. Families whose relatives had traveled aboard the Mercy Belle were invited to attend. The announcement stirred emotions buried for nearly 20 years. Elderly widows unfolded faded claim receipts they had never thrown away. Grown children searched trunks for letters describing belongings lost with parents long gone. Some believed nothing would come of it. Others dared not hope. Horace Pembroke spent those same days moving quietly through town. He assured influential merchants that Eleanor sought attention rather than justice. He suggested that old grief should remain buried instead of reopening painful wounds. Several businessmen agreed. They argued that returning forgotten property after 2 decades would create legal confusion and damage confidence in local commerce. Yet ordinary townspeople remembered different things. They remembered Eleanor reading difficult letters for widows. They remembered accurate accounts, fair treatment, and years of quiet service before her dismissal. Confidence slowly shifted. On the appointed morning, nearly the entire town gathered beside the Greystone River. The sheriff, county clerk, Reverend Alder, Amos Bell, and 2 circuit judges stood together as official witnesses. Eleanor guided them carefully across temporary planks laid over the exposed wreck. Horace Pembroke watched from the shoreline with folded arms. Eleanor knelt before the reinforced hatch. She withdrew the brass baggage token and inserted its grooved edge into the lock. The familiar click echoed across the silent river. Together, the sheriff and Amos Bell lifted the heavy hatch. A cool breath of preserved air rose from the darkness below. Lanterns illuminated shelves exactly as Eleanor had found them. No one spoke. Even Horace remained motionless. One by one, the witnesses descended into the compartment. They emerged carrying carefully labeled trunks, document boxes, leather satchels, wrapped parcels, and locked strongboxes, each bearing names preserved by Captain Mercer's meticulous records. Gasps spread through the crowd as familiar family names appeared. Some elderly residents began weeping before any container had even been opened. The county clerk compared every recovered item against the captain's inventory. They matched. Every page, every shelf, every numbered package. Reverend Alder then unfolded Captain Mercer's letter and read it aloud. The riverbank remained utterly silent, except for his steady voice. When he reached the passage describing attempts to remove selected valuables without lawful receipts before departure, dozens of eyes turned toward Horace Pembroke. The sheriff requested that the remaining documents be examined immediately. Inside the locked purser's case rested correspondence bearing Nathaniel Pembroke's signature, authorizing irregular transfers of passenger property before scheduled crossings under vague accounting procedures. Though the papers did not prove theft beyond question, they established enough evidence to reopen investigations long considered impossible. Horace attempted to dismiss the documents as misunderstandings involving his late father. Yet each explanation weakened beneath the weight of Captain Mercer's inventory, the preserved receipts, and the untouched property itself. Why had no effort ever been made to recover the secure compartment if company officials truly believed it empty? Why had references to the passenger vault gradually disappeared from official accounts? Why had Eleanor been dismissed immediately after questioning missing cargo, following patterns resembling those described decades earlier? The questions no longer belonged to one overlooked clerk. They belonged to the entire town. Over the following weeks, county officials supervised the painstaking return of every identifiable possession. The process unfolded with remarkable care. Families presented old claim receipts, letters, photographs, Bible inscriptions, and other evidence establishing ownership. Whenever uncertainty existed, Eleanor insisted no item should change hands until certainty prevailed. Her patience prevented arguments before they could begin. The first reunion took place when 90-year-old Abigail Morton received the wedding rings she had believed lost forever as a young bride. She pressed the tiny velvet bundle against her heart and whispered through tears that she could almost hear her mother's laughter again. Another family opened a document chest containing land deeds proving ownership of acreage that had long since been absorbed into neighboring farms. Rather than sparking bitter disputes, the discovery led current landowners to negotiate fair settlements, recognizing that the documents had been hidden rather than surrendered. The carved wooden music box belonging to Edith Fairchild's family still played its gentle melody after careful cleaning by the town clockmaker. People gathered simply to listen. Veterans' medals found their way into trembling hands. Children's toys were placed before grandchildren who had known them only through stories. Bundles of letters reunited brothers and sisters with words written by parents whose voices had vanished decades earlier. The greatest treasure proved not to be gold at all. It was memory, returned in tangible form. Newspapers from neighboring counties traveled to Brimstead to report the astonishing recovery. They praised Captain Elias Mercer's integrity, the county's careful stewardship, and above all the perseverance of Eleanor Harrow, whose refusal to ignore inconvenient numbers had uncovered one of the region's greatest forgotten stories. State investigators soon reopened historical company records. Financial irregularities stretching back years surfaced beneath renewed examination. Though Nathaniel Pembroke had long since passed away, his carefully polished reputation crumbled beneath documented evidence. Several properties accumulated through questionable transfers were ordered sold, with proceeds placed into a community restoration fund, benefiting descendants of affected families and public improvements throughout Brimstead. Horace Pembroke resigned quietly before formal proceedings concluded. He departed town with little ceremony, leaving behind the office where he had once believed authority alone could silence uncomfortable truth. Few celebrated his downfall. Most simply continued rebuilding what dishonesty had delayed. Eleanor declined every proposal that sought to enrich her personally. The sheriff argued she deserved a substantial reward. Merchants offered generous gifts. Newspaper editors suggested lecture tours. She accepted only reimbursement for the auction price, recovery expenses, and enough modest compensation to purchase a small cottage overlooking the river. The remaining legal salvage award she donated toward repairing the aging public docks, expanding the church reading room, and establishing a permanent archive preserving Captain Mercer's records, alongside the recovered inventory, so future generations would never again lose them to convenience or neglect. Beside the restored docks, townspeople raised a simple stone memorial overlooking the Greystone River. It honored the passengers of the Mercy Belle, Captain Elias Mercer, and all who protect what belongs to others, even when no one is watching. Eleanor requested that her own name appear nowhere upon the monument. Reverend Alder smiled when he learned of her request. "History will remember anyway," he said softly. Seasons continued their familiar journey across Brimstead. Ferries crossed calmer waters. Children once again laughed along the docks. Travelers paused to read the memorial before boarding. The restored reading room welcomed anyone wishing to study the recovered records, and many left with a renewed respect for ordinary honesty. Eleanor resumed bookkeeping, this time as clerk for the county, rather than any private company. Her ledgers became known for remarkable precision, but people admired something deeper than accurate figures. They admired the quiet courage required to keep asking truthful questions after the world had already decided the answers no longer mattered. We began by telling you about a 38-year-old woman standing beside the Greystone River with only $3.72, after powerful men cast her aside for refusing to ignore inconvenient facts. We told you she spent $2 on a forgotten sunken ferry, while others laughed at such foolishness. Looking back now, the purchase was never truly about old timber resting beneath muddy water. It was about faith that forgotten things still possess value, that patient honesty eventually uncovers what hurried ambition buries, and that communities heal not through grand speeches, but through ordinary people quietly choosing what is right, when no applause is expected. Eleanor Harrow never searched for treasure. She searched for truth. Treasure simply happened to be waiting beside it. The ferry she purchased did far more than preserve valuables. It preserved trust, until someone worthy arrived to receive it. The river had guarded that trust through storms, changing seasons, and passing generations, but it required the overlooked hands of one dismissed woman to lift the final hatch. Sometimes history survives not because it is powerful, but because someone refuses to stop listening after everyone else has walked away. And perhaps that is why the people of Brimstead eventually spoke Eleanor's name with the same quiet respect once reserved for Captain Mercer. Not because she became wealthy or famous, but because she reminded an entire town that integrity can remain hidden for years without ever truly being lost. Thank you for spending this time with us beside the Greystone River and for allowing Eleanor Harrow's story to unfold at its own patient pace. If this story stayed with you, we hope you'll share it with someone who believes overlooked things and overlooked people still matter. Before you go, we'd love to hear your answer to one question. What is a time you found value in something everyone else had written off? Until next time, stay close.
If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every message helps keep these forgotten stories alive.